the coordinator for the Northern Virginia and DC chapter of CHAD. Tonight, we are so pleased to have Dr. Kathleen Nadeau from the Chesapeake Center present Still Distracted After All These Years, Older Adults with ADHD, and hope that you'll continue to join us to hear future lectures in this series. As we've done in the past lectures, when you have comments or questions during this lecture, please type them in the chat feature and our moderators will share your input with Dr. Nadeau. Our chapter, if you're not familiar with us, the CHAD of Northern Virginia and DC is one of the many chapters in the CHAD National Organization, and as such aligns the national mission of improving the lives of those affected with ADHD. We are a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offer support to our ADHD community, such as this free monthly lecture series on the second Tuesday evening of most months, support groups for parents, students, and adults, and a yearly resource fair to highlight ADHD Awareness Month. While we are all volunteers, we cover our expenses through membership, dues, donations, and sponsorships. If you believe in our cause and have the funds to do so, we urge you to become a member of CHAD if you are not already one. Now to introduce our speaker, Kathleen Nadeau has been studying older adults for the past several years, interviewing older adults with ADHD across the country as she works on her upcoming groundbreaking book, Still Distracted After All These Years. Our chapter, is so fortunate that she has dedicated her time and expertise to many of our lectures and resource fairs over the years. And now we are again fortunate tonight to have Dr. Nadeau present this very important lecture. Welcome, Dr. Nadeau.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, I see a few familiar names and faces, and I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share. So I'll tell you about my project, and then hopefully we'll stop around 8 p.m. thereabouts so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So delighted to be here and delighted that everybody is interested in this topic that is near and dear to my heart. So just a little bit about the topic, because I think it's funny, we were talking about that earlier. When I first started working on this project, people would say, well, what's your next book about? And I said, older adults with ADHD. And that sounded like such a dreary topic. And people would go, okay, that's nice. And all of a sudden, it came to me. I was out walking. I think that when we walk, I'm not sure why that's popping around that way, that we have more creative ideas. And it suddenly occurred to me, instead of still crazy after all these years, still distracted after all these years. And that's such a boomer popular song that I figured all of my age mates could definitely relate. So still distracted after all these years. So I have absolutely no conflicts of interest in relation to this program. Let me tell you a little bit about what I've been doing. I interviewed 150 adults, all of whom were age 60 or older, and I found them in a number of different ways. I advertised in Attention, I advertised in Attitude magazine, and I also reached out to my colleagues that I knew were interested in older adults. So they were people from my clinic, from David Goodman's adult ADHD clinic in Baltimore, and some other people that I know. So the reason I'm mentioning that is I think it's really important to understand that in no way have I interviewed and studied random sampling of older adults with ADHD. The adults that I've interviewed are all formally diagnosed by a mental health professional, and because they're interested in ADHD, they found my ad in the back of a magazine, or they're already in treatment. It's a much more educated, higher functioning group of adults with ADHD. And I think it's really important to understand that. And I in the book that I've been working on that I hope will be published later this year, um, I go out of my way to say that too, that there are many adults with ADHD that are struggling to a much greater extent than the adults that I had the privilege of talking to. And I want to keep that in mind because there's enormous need there that needs to be addressed. So I've been, for those of you who know me, I've been in the ADHD world for a long, long time. Basically, I have been in it since the late 70s when the public laws changed, um, basically mandating that kids diagnosed with ADHD get accommodations in school. And that led to my clinic, which was a general mental health clinic, being flooded with requests for diagnosis of ADHD. And at that time, I didn't think it was going to be very interesting because I, like everybody else in the field, thought I was just going to be looking at a bunch of hyperactive 8-year-old behavior disordered boys. And not only that, but I had been taught, as everyone had been taught, during my training, that this was a disorder that was outgrown. By the time these boys got to be 12 or 13, they would be less hyperactive, and it was mostly better then. Well, we know that none of that is true. It's not uh, an affliction that's specific to boys. We certainly don't outgrow it. And when I started working with the families, and parents, of course, told me I was just like that when I was a kid, or my brother was just like that, it just became very evident that it was a much more complex and long-lasting set of issues, not just dealing with 8-year-old hyperactive boys. So I became very interested in adults with ADHD because of the parents of the kids that I was treating. And I had the privilege of editing really the first book for professionals that was published on the diagnosis and treatment of adults with ADHD. And it came out in the same year as Driven to Distraction came out in 1995. There seemed to be something in the water that year. Everybody was figuring out we need to pay more attention to adults. And so then my focus with my book coming out really shifted to a focus on adults. And in 1995, there were almost no such thing, perhaps actually no such thing as an adult ADHD clinic. And they sprung up at several universities. Yale University started an ADHD clinic with Tom Brown. Some of you know Tom Brown. The University of Massachusetts started one, and Russell Barkley was involved in that. And suddenly lots and lots of adults were seeking diagnosis. And interestingly, and a lot of people don't know this, but the statistics show that as those adult ADHD clinics sprung up, that more females than males sought diagnosis and treatment through those clinics. So here we're suddenly discovering it's not just for kids, and lots of evidence that it certainly isn't a male dominant disorder. We see very different statistics when we're looking at adults. We see much more of an even distribution of ADHD among adults. And I think that's just because we don't really do a good job of identifying the girls, but once they reach adulthood, they can seek diagnosis for themselves. So I set out with no preconceptions in mind to just try to learn what are the primary issues faced by older adults with ADHD. So this is qualitative, not quantitative research. All of the adults that I worked with were volunteers, and as I told you before, they found me through word of mouth or in Attitude magazine. Each adult agreed to a 1-hour semi-structured phone interview, and I had them complete a detailed questionnaire beforehand that I had developed to explore the issues faced by older adults. And as I said before, they very definitely tended to be skewed toward being better informed about ADHD and more highly educated. So, some of you may be aware of this, but so many adults sought diagnosis after not having been diagnosed in childhood that they started talking about, is there such a thing as adult onset ADHD? And after several years of debating that at various conferences, the consensus came out that it's not adult onset, but really a delayed diagnosis of ADHD, and lots of different reasons why somebody might not get diagnosed. I just thought this was my personality. It's just how I was. We certainly didn't know much about ADHD when people who were adults or older adults were kids. Females, we know, were overlooked and in many cases still are. And those with an above average IQ were able to compensate. We find that the least likely person to be diagnosed as a child is a high IQ female who comes from a stable, supportive home. Those girls go under the radar and often are not diagnosed until college, and in some cases not diagnosed until they're in graduate school or professional school. And as Tom Brown has said, and I think it's a good thing to remember, that our ADHD is always there, but it emerges if and when we get to a stage in our lives when the demands placed upon us are greater than our ability to compensate for them. And so that's why it so often happens when we're in graduate school and can't finish our dissertation, or we're in medical school and we can't pass our boards. And often because there's so many comorbidities that come along with ADHD, it's often misdiagnosed as anxiety or depression, or at least it's an incomplete diagnosis. The anxiety or depression may be there, but the ADHD is there for sure. So, lots and lots of different psychiatric disorders are comorbid with ADHD. So almost 20% have anxiety. I'm surprised it's not higher than that. 7% struggle with depression, bipolar. PTSD, ASD eating disorders are less frequent than ADHD. 4% of the general adult population, give or take, has ADHD. So it's one of the most common disorders. And yet, as I'll show you in the next slide, there's remarkably little treatment. Some of you may have had the privilege of listening to David Goodman. He's a friend of mine. We've known each other for years, and he has been giving lectures on ADHD in older adults and adults in general. And he talks a lot about the minimal training that psychiatrists receive in diagnosing and treating adult ADHD. Over the 3 years of psychiatric training and residency, he has found that approximately half a day is devoted to adult ADHD. And this is in spite of the fact that statistically it's one of the most common adult psychiatric disorders.
Kathleen, I hate to interrupt that, but I'm going to ask if everyone can see the screen and the presentation. There was a notation that somebody can't see the presentation on the screen. Is anyone else having that problem? I'm not, but just wanted to make sure that it wasn't a larger issue. And I don't think so, but if I hear anybody, everybody says looks fine. Okay, so maybe it's just a onesie problem. I apologize for the interruption. Please continue.
No problem, no problem. So one of the things that's very important to talk about is whether ADHD is a precursor to dementia in older age. And I actually talked about this with several psychiatrists over the years who made an assumption that it probably is a precursor, that you already have this compromised cognitive status and it'll only get worse with age. But the good news is that this study in particular, they gave the Winder Utah Rating Scale, which is one of the oldest and most commonly used adult ADHD rating scales, to over 300 older subjects, and they found that a little over 4% of them had ADHD, and that the ADHD scores were not related in any way to cognitive status in later life. So the ADHD symptoms are pretty stable across our lifespan, and they're not related to dementia, which is very good news. So many memory clinics now are finding that adults with never diagnosed ADHD are coming in for diagnosis about memory problems because they are worried that they're developing dementia. And interestingly, these are people that have had ADHD their whole life. And I think the memory problems just become more frightening as we get older. When we're 45, 50, 55, we're not worried that it's incipient dementia, but when we get into our 60s and 70s, we do start worrying. And we don't have a good ADHD screening tool for older adults. It hasn't been developed. So they use just the fairly standard adult ADHD screeners and sometimes use a lower cutoff score to begin the diagnostic process. What's so important and often doesn't happen is it's important to interview somebody, a family member, a spouse, a sibling, somebody that knew you when you were much younger, that can attest to the fact that you've had problems with memory, disorganization, forgetfulness, time issues for years, that this isn't a sudden onset. And it's also really important because ADHD is so highly genetic in nature that, for one, I think all of these memory clinics should be asking, are there younger family members, middle-aged and young family members, children and grandchildren, that have been diagnosed with ADHD? Because that's another strong sign that what we're dealing with is a never diagnosed ADHD in an older adult. So mild cognitive impairment is often a precursor for dementia, and there's not a specific set of symptoms that's associated with mild cognitive impairment, but just cognitive change in general, evidence of decline, and it's especially important. And I really think that dementia is so common and ADHD is so common that we ought to have cognitive testing to establish a baseline when we're in our early 60s, just the way we do all kinds of testing to make sure that we're not developing an age-related type of disability, because that makes it much easier. If there has been testing and then retesting and there's evidence of decline, that's a sign that it's probably either ADHD plus dementia or simply dementia. And I want to make very clear that having ADHD doesn't protect us from dementia. It just doesn't make us more at risk for developing dementia. So in mild cognitive impairment, you're generally functional in your daily functioning, but memory issues and being able to retrieve specific facts may be beginning to show their head. And a lack of a medical cause for cognitive decline. Obviously, if you've had some kind of head injury, then it's not age-related cognitive decline. So ADHD does differ from mild cognitive impairment. And as I've said a couple of times, it's always been there. It's not associated with aging. And somebody described it as Swiss cheese memory. I find that many people with ADHD can easily remember a fact one day and can't retrieve it for the life of them the next day. Very unpredictable gaps in memory, which is different from just having a poor memory for recent events. It's not, people with ADHD don't have trouble remembering what they ate for breakfast this morning, but they often do have trouble remembering names and dates and facts and long ago events. Distractibility, misplacing things, never completed projects, very, very common in older adults with ADHD. General disorganization, difficulty planning, and emotional regulation issues. Now, there is certainly overlap between some of these issues and cognitive decline that is signaling the beginning of dementia. But when you are able to interview them about lifelong issues and when you're able to discern that there are other people in the family diagnosed with ADHD, the picture really begins to become clearer. So one of the things that I want to share with you, I interviewed these 150 people and they told me some fascinating stories, some of which I'll share later on in my talk. But one of the things I wanted to understand are what are the primary challenges once we're in our mid 60s and beyond. And here's what I learned. The number one challenge, the number one complaint, and I think this is important, is not getting things done. And I did not find that in talking to older adults without ADHD. So older people with ADHD are still struggling with procrastination, having trouble getting started on tasks. Does this sound familiar? They've been struggling with this all their lives. Lack of motivation, don't stay on task, get distracted, never finish the project, but very frustrated with that. I mean, many of them said to me, I dreamt that once I was no longer working, once my kids were raised, I could finally get back to my painting or my woodworking or my writing or whatever it was that they had felt they had to put off for so many years. And they find that they're really having trouble getting focused and doing the things that they had dreamed of doing for so long. The second most common challenge is reporting that my emotions are not under control. I get very irritated, easily frustrated. I there certainly is overlap, but more of the men that I interviewed talked about angry outbursts, irritation, irritability, and women talked more about anxiety, feeling inadequate, fearing that they were being judged, particularly by other women whose lives were better organized. Women, more so than men, report feeling overwhelmed. In fact, that's a term I hear from women throughout their lifespan. What's it like to have ADHD? I feel constantly overwhelmed. So many things are coming at me all the time. So I have anxiety and a lot of regret. What if I'd known 50 years ago that I had ADHD? And some of the parents, older parents, were saying, my children have gotten what I didn't get. I made sure they got it. I got them diagnosed. I got them in treatment, and they haven't had the struggles and the regrets that I'm having. And so that's hopeful because as we get more and more people diagnosed in early adulthood, I think this is going to be hopefully more of a thing of the past. poor time management is the number 3 complaint. People just getting lost in space. It's interesting. I am leading a group at my clinic on life skills. And we're doing very, very simple lessons in each meeting. And then we give a homework assignment, just really analyzing how to get things done, how to plan a task, how to complete the task. And yet I find the adults in the group saying, I just don't know when to schedule it. I don't have a schedule. And I think this is much more true during COVID when people who are working from home. I have no idea where the time goes. It feels like I'm going constantly all day. I don't have anything to show for it at the end of the day. I'm still running late. And women in particular say, I've lost friends because I'm always running late. They feel that I'm not respecting their time. And it's not that at all. It's that it's so hard for me to get things done and stay aware of what time it is simultaneously. This is one that surprised me too, reporting that I still have sort of the remnants of hyperactivity, even though I'm 70 years old. I'm still restless. A lot of it is mental restlessness, but many women in particular say, I talk too much, and I know I drive people crazy. I try not to talk too much. I try not to interrupt. It's very hard for me. Inability to relax and overcommitting, taking on too many things, because along with that hyperactivity is sort of a stimulation craving. Oh, that looks interesting. Oh, that looks good. I'd like to join that, with no real sense of, can I really fit it into my life? Interpersonal relationships continue to be challenging for older adults. And before I began this talk tonight, we were just chatting for a few minutes, and I was saying that one of my hopes is that Chad will sponsor a series of online support groups for older adults, because it's so important to finally find your tribe, to be around people who aren't going to judge you as harshly, that understand what you're struggling with because they struggle with it too. But so many people, especially females, feel judged by their peers. They tell me I need to be a better listener. I jump in, I talk too much, I'm so busy talking. I miss the social cues, that people are tired of my talking on and on about whatever the topic is. Men, interestingly, tell me, they keep telling me I'm using the wrong tone of voice, that I sound angry or critical, and I'm not feeling that way, but I sound that way. And I just don't seem to fit into social groups. And sadly, sometimes this results in social withdrawal, that I'm just tired of trying to fit in, and so I'm just going to live a much more isolated life, which I think is a very poor idea in terms of maintenance of mental health. So I want to tell you about something, and I imagine some of you have already heard about it because it's very startling research. Russell Barkley, who's one of the most renowned and respected ADHD researchers, came into a conference that I was attending about 3 years ago, and announced to all and sundry at a great meeting of that conference his research that reports that combined type ADHD, which, as I'm sure you all know, means that there is still some impulsivity and hyperactivity involved, that life expectancy is reduced by almost 13 years. That's an incredible statistic, an alarming statistic. And even those who are not combined type still have reduced life expectancy by 8 years. And so put putting that in context, for those of you who've read any of the research, you'll read reports that ADHD is less common in older age, and so there was an assumption it must get better. Well, Russ Barkley is telling us it's not getting better, it's that an awful lot of people with ADHD are no longer alive. That's why the percentages are lower in old age than in middle age. They're no longer alive. So what causes this reduced lifespan? Barkley calls it low conscientiousness. And I wish he had chosen a different term because that feels judgmental. You're not very conscientious. But what he means by that is that people with ADHD have trouble controlling their impulses and have trouble doing something that is beneficial in the long term, but not very gratifying in the short term. And what I mean by that is that people with ADHD are likely to eat food that tastes good, that we know is not healthy for us, junk food, fast food, ice cream, because it tastes so good. And it's hard for people with ADHD to control those impulses, especially if the food is around you, knowing, no, I shouldn't do that because I'm going to get heart disease, high cholesterol. We also know now that even Alzheimer's is related in many ways to lifespan. I'll talk a little bit more that later. So people with ADHD are more likely to smoke. They're more likely to consume unhealthy quantities of alcohol, and they're more likely to be obese or to have a high body mass index. And all of those things are connected to shorter lifespan. When you add in the impulsivity, restlessness of combined type ADHD, those folks have more accidents. So the rate of death in an accident is significantly higher for adults with ADHD than for adults without ADHD. And of course, there are all the psychiatric comorbidities that go along. Depression and anxiety and chronic stress, the stress of poor money management, the stress of unemployment and underemployment that makes life become more and more challenging as we get older. So what adults with ADHD do live into old age? Well, no surprise, they're the ones who are the predominantly inattentive type because they have avoided the impulsivity that leads to driving too fast, to doing things without thinking about them. I can't tell you how many men that I've worked with who have fallen off ladders, hit their head, just not being as careful. I didn't want to wait for somebody to hold the ladder. I needed to go up the tree and get something, and boom, they've had an accident. People with higher intelligence tend to live longer, better executive functioning, which makes a lot of sense, more educated people, and very especially those in supportive long-term relationships. Close relationships are very good for our mental and physical health. So what should ADHD treatment focus on in older adults? I will tell you that there is a researcher named Dale Bredesen. Some of you may have read about him. He's becoming better and better known. But Dale Bredesen is a geriatric researcher. He's the head of a big institute on aging out at UCLA. And a number of years ago, I came across an article he'd written called Reversal of Cognitive Decline. And my ears really perked up. I'd never heard of anybody reversing cognitive decline. And what he had done was an interesting idea. He said, I'm just going to look at the research and look at everything that improves cognitive functioning. I'm going to take a group of adults in their 60s who have experienced significant cognitive decline and see what happens if I can convince them to engage in these brain-friendly daily habits that will improve your health and your cognition. And those brain-friendly daily habits had to do with sleep, had to do with healthy nutrition, had to do with aerobic exercise, with stress management. Stress is very hard on the brain. We're bathing our brains in cortisol if we are chronically stressed, and that will certainly lead to cognitive decline. And what he reported in this little tiny pilot study was with only 10 adults, 9 out of those 10 significantly improved in cognitive functioning over the course of the next couple of years. He wrote about it. He wrote a book, which some of you may be familiar with, called The End of Alzheimer's, that came out several years ago. And the Cleveland Clinic, I'm sure everybody's heard of the Cleveland Clinic, now uses the Bredesen protocol, recommends it to their patients, and there's a big research project going on at the NIH now to test his findings in a very large cohort. So it's very exciting news. And what that says is those of us with ADHD are more at risk for cognitive decline because of our lifestyle. And when I read his first article, I said that should be the treatment protocol for adult ADHD. Of course, executive functioning coaching is very important because those are the kind of skills that don't come naturally when you have ADHD, and the life skills group that I'm leading at the Chesapeake Center is focused on executive functioning and developing better abilities to plan, organize, complete tasks, etc. And reducing social isolation with more support and inclusion. We know across the board, not just related to ADHD, that we'll live longer if we're socially supported and connected. And the danger is that because people with ADHD have had such chronic problems with fitting in socially, that they're more likely to be isolated in later years. Adults can benefit from psychostimulants. One of the problems is that there are almost no physicians trained in treating older adults with stimulant medication for ADHD, and the great majority of them simply refuse to do so. They mistakenly think that it's too dangerous. They don't want to get involved in it. They don't want to be sued. It's your fault. My dad had a heart attack because you prescribed stimulants. And there's a fairly good body of research now that shows that older adults can take prescribed stimulants and benefit from them as long as we make sure to explore the cardiac issues and get clearance for cardiac issues. One of the psychiatrists at my clinic has everyone take an EKG if he's going to prescribe stimulants to them. And what a lot of people don't realize, here are all these psychiatrists refusing to prescribe stimulants for older adults, and yet older adults are routinely in nursing care facilities prescribed stimulants, not for ADHD, but basically for low alertness and low energy levels. So it's really ironic that we've been using them for years in a geriatric population, but those treating ADHD don't know about that. So the environment that we place ourselves in, and this is true at every single stage of life, has a huge impact on how much our ADHD is going to get in the way of our functioning. And what happens as we get older and we leave the workplace is we're going through challenges that are very similar to those faced by young adults with ADHD leaving home and going out into the world. And by that I mean that the structure that we're used to having in the workplace, a place to go, a time to go there, a task to do when we get there that structures our days. There's the week, there's the weekend, all of that structure goes away. and it becomes much harder to function. I've had mothers surprisingly tell me that I was actually more organized when my kids were growing up, even though it was challenging, because they had a schedule and I had to adhere to their schedule. Now they're grown, now I'm retired. There is no schedule, and I'm kind of lost in space as I go through my day. Uh, and I have been concerned that a lot of the adults that I've worked with develop very poor sleep habits and nutritional habits because there's not necessarily any meal time, especially if you're living at home. And there's no real reason to go to bed at a good hour, even though all the studies show that we're much healthier if we sleep at night and are awake during the daytime. I mean, that's how our brains are structured for tens of thousands of years. And yet it's so easy to fall into bad habits and staying up very late and living on crackers and cheese or little container of yogurt because we don't feel like preparing proper meals. And so we're putting ourselves at further risk. And so for some people with ADHD, I think they will function much better in a community that provides a lot of structure that they don't have to create for themselves. There is a huge retirement community in Central Florida. Some of you may be familiar with it, and called the Villages. And I have been in touch with several people living there, and I suspect that there is a much higher rate of ADHD among people living in the villages. They are attracted to living there because A, it's affordable. You don't have to have a big retirement income. B, it really supports being active. Your social life is built in. It's just much easier to move into a community like that and not become isolated and inactive. So ADHD, as is true at all ages and stages, differs from one person to another. And I don't want us to fall into stereotypes because there are lots of different outcomes, and I think it's important for us to understand them. So one of the things that really surprised me, I call this still married after all these years, that there were many long-term successful marriages among the people that I interviewed. And perhaps not surprisingly, the great majority of those were second marriages. Many of the people I interviewed had an early impulsive marriage that was conflictual and often very short-lived. And then when they were more mature and had a better sense of what they needed in a partner, remarried and have had very long, successful marriages. And I can't tell you how many people have told me, I'm terrified at the thought of losing my spouse, that my spouse has become my support system. My spouse doesn't have ADHD and helps to keep me on track and keep me on time. So I think it would be really important to study the characteristics of these longstanding marriages, because we all have the stereotypic, oh, they're all divorced, and a lot of them have been divorced 3 times. You know, we've just focused on the negative, and that wasn't my finding at all. So still struggling after all these years. It is very true that some of the adults that I talked with are really having a hard time in their later years. They're still struggling with anxiety and depression. They have very little money. They tell me this is not the retirement I dreamt of. I have no money to travel. I don't really have money to lead a comfortable life. Some of the people said I would really be in bad shape, except I inherited the house I grew up in and that's where I'm living, you know, that something came along to rescue them. And people telling me I still feel like I don't fit in. I remember talking to a woman whose church was her main source of social connection, and she said even there, other women still rejected her. She talks too much, she's too bossy, she interrupts. And so she said, you know what I've started doing at my church is taking care of the grounds, taking care of the flowers, helping to weed, because I'm out there by myself. I'm not bothering anyone, but I still feel a connection to the church. And sadly, people that are doing badly often have weak family connections. It takes effort. It takes intention to stay connected with our families, especially here in the US, where people frequently move far away from where they grew up as adults. It takes a lot of effort and motivation to stay connected. And often, if we're the black sheep of the family, if we're the one that didn't do as well as our siblings, we may feel badly about ourselves when we get together with the rest of the family and are motivated to do it less and less. Then there are those people that say, I've never been happier in my life. And I think it's really important to know that there are those people. I remember interviewing a lovely woman who had had a terrible struggle in her middle years. Her husband had a chronic disease and died when he was in his late 40s, and she was left to raise her two children by herself, and she managed to do it. She got her children diagnosed and treated. They both had ADHD, as did she. And now she is in her mid 70s, and she said, this is a wonderful time in my life. I'm very connected to my community. I think that's a huge key. She volunteered at a senior center. She loves to write, and she is in charge of the monthly newsletter of the senior center. She feels purposeful, connected, useful, and much less stressed now that she's not working and now that she's not having to focus on raising her kids. So the later years for some, if they stay connected and have a sense of purpose, can be wonderful years. This is the woman I was telling you about that never been happier. And she just was a poster child for what we need to do to stay connected and have happy years in retirement. So, and this is my last slide, and I want to talk about just what I would like clinicians to know, and I don't know if there are clinicians in the audience, but if somebody, an older adult, is coming to you saying, I think I might have ADHD, one of the first things you should find out about is there ADHD diagnosed in younger family members? That is a big clue. Interview adult children, have them complete questionnaires, and focus on the long term. Don't just focus on how they're functioning now. Focus on the long term. Have these issues been there for a long time? And of course, ADHD issues can become worse as we age because we're eating poorly, we're not getting good sleep, we may have other health issues that interfere with our sleep. In terms of treatment, I really want there to be more psychiatrists and neurologists out there talking to their fellow physicians about considering prescribing psychostimulants. I mean, even at my own clinic, there is hesitancy to prescribe stimulants for older adults simply because they've got no training and no experience in it. I'm actually having David Goodman, who's a psychiatrist in the Baltimore area, give a presentation to my medical staff about prescribing stimulants for older adults because they need more education about it. Don't get hung up with the comorbid issues and ignore the ADHD. That happens so often. Work with an executive functioning coach who can help the adult you're working with build those brain-friendly, healthy daily habits that Dale Bredesen did research on. And if they're really lost in space, if they are isolated, if they're having trouble staying connected in any way, encourage them to consider living in a senior community. It's interesting, I have been co-leading a support group for older adults ever since COVID started, and have gotten to know some of the members fairly well. And there is a woman who just announced to the group a few days ago that she had decided to move. And she said, I know it sounds crazy at my age to be moving, but she had discovered a very interesting and very affordable community in the Washington area. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's often called Old Greenbelt. And it was built during the Depression. My apologies. It was built during the Depression, very small townhouses, but it's become a very affordable, very social and socially supportive community. And I think she is making a great move by doing that. So that is the end of my talk, and I am open for questions and discussions and very eager to hear what people would like to know. So I'm going to stop my screen share.
There was an early question early on, and if I missed you answering this, please let me know. Somebody asked if there are emotional regulation issues noted in childhood, those tend to get better as people aged.
This is a question. Do they get better with age?
Do they? Did they? I mean, did people report
yes.
Getting
I think many things tend to get better with age for a very simple reason, and that is that self-regulation, emotional regulation, planning, organizing, managing our time, managing our finances, all those self-management skills that are often lacking when we're younger get better because our prefrontal lobes continue to mature until we're in our late 20s or even early 30s. And when we have ADHD, that maturation is often delayed by 2 or 3 years. So somebody that is 35 with ADHD, for the most part, is going to be much better at emotional self-regulation and all sorts of other types of self-regulation. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody gets well regulated. One of the things that I want to talk about is we have for all these years considered ADHD a categorical disorder. You either have it or you don't have it. And I've never thought that was a good way to diagnose ADHD. It's ridiculous. If you have 6 symptoms, you have it. If you have 5 symptoms, you don't have it. ADHD exists along a continuum, as everything does. Anxiety, depression, ADHD, you name it, exists along a continuum. And so there are people who were severely affected as children that may still be severely affected as adults. And those are people who are getting themselves in pretty clear trouble, getting fired from jobs because they lose their temper. I'm not going to take that from you, walking off the job, multiple divorces because of emotional dysregulation, automobile accidents, substance abuse issues. That's at one extreme end of the continuum. That's certainly not the majority of people with ADHD. But in general, our brains grow up. Our prefrontal lobes are the part of the brain that is hugely impacted by ADHD. Stimulants sort of wake up our prefrontal lobes so that they function better, but they become more mature. So yes, until our mid-30s or so, we're getting better able to function. And it's so important that we start learning the life management skills that we didn't develop when we were younger and much more easily frustrated and impulsive.
Thank you. There were a couple of other questions too about medication. One person was asking if there are other medications that are non-stimulant meds that might be safer for older adults who have cardiac issues. And then another person asked if Vyvanse was safe for people if there were no heart concerns present. So I don't know how.
Well, I'm happy to respond to those questions with the caveat that I am not a physician. I don't prescribe medication. I've certainly worked with countless people that take medication. And the great majority of older adults can safely take stimulant medications, including Vyvanse. There are two families of stimulant medication in general, and one is the methylphenidate family, Focalin, Ritalin, Concerta, that's all methylphenidate. And then there's the dextroamphetamine family, and Vyvanse, Adderall, dextroamphetamine fall into that family. And they are both routinely prescribed for older adults. And everybody has their own health issues. So it needs to be carefully done. I mean, we are, many of us, more physically fragile as we get older, but there shouldn't be this caveat that stimulants shouldn't be prescribed for older adults, because they can benefit tremendously. And I can't tell you how many adults told me it was life transforming when I finally was prescribed stimulants.
Mhm. Thank you. Another person asked, because we had been talking about emotional regulation just a couple of questions ago, what actually helps with emotional regulation?
Well, stimulant medication can absolutely help with emotional regulation. I mean, stimulant medication helps with self-management in general, including getting upset. But there are also a number of therapeutic approaches. I don't know how many of you are familiar with DBT, but DBT therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, was developed for people with borderline personality disorder. And that is a disorder that is characterized by extreme emotional dysregulation. And so Marsha Linehan developed DBT. It's very effective, but now DBT is being modified and used in treatment with people with ADHD and emotional dysregulation. And basically, it is learning to understand yourself, learning techniques to calm yourself down, to realize that you're being ruled by your emotional brain and not your logical brain. There's a term in DBT therapy of use your wise mind, which is a combination of your logical brain, your emotional brain. We need both, and they need to work in tandem. When we have real emotional dysregulation, we're just operating out of pure emotional brain, as all young children do. But as we get older and our prefrontal lobes really come online, then we have more of a balance.
Thank you. Another person asked about what is an executive functioning coach, and how do you find one who specializes in treating adults with ADHD?
There are many, many coaches now that treat adults with ADHD. It's not hard to find. There are national coaching associations that certify coaches. It's important to understand that there's no licensure for a coach. So anybody can legally call themselves a coach and start coaching. Not too many people do that. There's wonderful training available, and I've seen the profession really mature over the past 25 years. So going to one of the national coaching associations, they'll have lists of people there that are certified by that organization, meaning that they've had many hours of training and supervision. But it really isn't hard to find someone that specializes in adults, which is good.
Yeah. I think there's also, at least around here in Northern Virginia, the ADHD Resource Group of Northern Virginia has a directory, and it specifies coaches who serve adults. So that might be another resource for people to take a look at. So this is an interesting question. Somebody asked, how do you explain as an adult that you have ADHD to your adult children who don't think that ADHD in adults actually exists?
That's a tough one. Now, it's rather unusual that an adult with ADHD have offspring, none of whom have ADHD. It is so highly genetic. There's at least a 50% chance we're going to have a child with ADHD if we have ADHD. So I think really what this question is asking is for people who aren't interested in learning about the brain and brain functioning, it's so easy to attribute everything to willful intention that, and sadly, I think our entire justice system still operates in that mode. I think it's absurd that the measure is, do you know the difference between right and wrong? And I would happily tell any judge, a 3-year-old knows the difference between right and wrong. I said, don't eat those cookies. I came back and you ate them. You knew you weren't supposed to eat them. Should we put that toddler in jail? They knew the difference between right and wrong, and they ate my cookies. And yet that is the judgment that we make. And what Russell Barkley has rather famously said, it's not that people with ADHD don't know what to do, it's that they don't do what they know. I would modify that and say that I think people with ADHD have great difficulty, as many of us do, doing what we know is good for us. I mean, we all know that exercise is good for us, but there are plenty of people without ADHD that don't exercise regularly because it really takes determination and self-discipline to always do what is going to benefit us in the long term instead of what we feel like in the short term. I see this debate going on in families all the time. I've had women say, oh, my family thinks I'm crazy. They think I say everybody has ADHD because I'm interested in it and I'm talking about it all the time. I think it's so important for families to get educated together. And it's an interesting conflict between, older adult parent and I assume adult offspring. But I think there's a suspicion that ADHD is being used as a big fat excuse. Oh, it's not me, it's my ADHD. You can't blame me. And what's so critical when we're talking with people who are judging us is to understand yourself and explain that saying that I have ADHD doesn't excuse everything. It just explains that it's harder for me than for people without ADHD to be accountable, to consistently not do things that we would like not to do.
There were a couple of different questions about differential diagnosis or assessment kinds of questions. One of them was, how do you tell the difference between high functioning autism and an ADHD diagnosis, particularly in women? And then another question related to assessment was somebody referring to rejection sensitive dysphoria and asking, well, is that the same thing as ADHD? And particularly, does that occur more in women than men?
Okay, well, those are two very different questions, and I'll take them one at a time. One of the things in terms of differential diagnosis that it's important to understand is that if you are on the autism spectrum, high functioning autism, there is a significant likelihood that you have ADHD. Those overlap. But the reverse is not true. If you have ADHD, you don't have a significant likelihood of being on the autism spectrum. So it's a subset of people on the spectrum. Many people on the spectrum also have ADHD. So it's not so much a differential diagnosis as realizing that both need to be treated. Not everybody with autism has ADHD, but if you're showing symptoms of ADHD, it really needs to be treated.
And then there was that question about rejection sensitive dysphoria.
That is a very new term that has come on the horizon. And there are some people that absolutely reject it. You know, that's ridiculous. That's just some new fad that people are talking about. But what I do think is very valid and true in all the years I've worked with people is that when we have lived our lives feeling criticized, rejected, ostracized, we develop and anticipate not being accepted, and it's very painful to go through life with untreated ADHD, especially if we happen to have the misfortune of being around critical or strict or judgmental people in our lives, whether they're parents, coaches, teachers, siblings, you name it. It has a huge impact on us. When Pat Quinn and I published our book on women with ADHD over 20 years ago now, we asked a woman who had done research on ADHD and trauma to write a chapter about the research she'd done. And she studied women in the Boston area in general, women who were immigrants who had come from very distressing circumstances in their home countries, often impoverished, physically abused, sometimes sexually abused, came to this country as immigrants. And she was studying them, and these were women in their 30s and even beyond who were at this late stage in their lives trying to get an education. They were attending classes at the local community college, and she studied and interviewed them. And they were women, all of whom were finally diagnosed with ADHD, which is why she was studying them. And she reported something remarkable. Given all of the traumatic circumstances that these women had experienced, especially before coming to the US, but even afterwards, they said that the most traumatizing experience in their life was growing up being judged for their ADHD. They had typically, and I see this happen in other parts of the world, they were raised in classrooms where the typical standard approach, if you weren't listening to the teacher, was to be publicly shamed by the teacher. Come and stand up in the front of the class and tell me right now why you didn't bring your homework in, why you didn't do it last night, why you weren't listening when I gave the instructions. And these were teachers completely ignorant about ADHD that thought it was just willful indifference that was making these girls not be able to stay tuned in class. Very, very traumatizing for them. I gave a series of lectures in private schools in Switzerland 8 or 10 years ago. And I've often talked about this. I mean, ADHD interacts with the environment in which we find ourselves. So there are some cultures that are much more ADHD friendly than others. And I think in many ways, the United States is one of the friendlier cultures to grow up in. There's a lot more tolerance for difference and for creativity and being an out-of-the-box thinker. But I was giving these lectures in Switzerland. I went there a couple of days early to de-jet lag a little bit, and I went to visit the Swiss Cultural Museum in Zurich. And I walk in the doors, and there's, you know, the symbol of Switzerland, the coat of arms, and the national values printed above the coat of arms. And I looked at it and thought, oh my gosh, to have ADHD in this country must be so painful. And I created an acronym so I could remember as PPOD: precision, punctuality, order, and discipline are the four values of the Swiss. I mean, remember, these are the watchmakers of the world. And it is miserable to have ADHD in Switzerland because the traits of ADHD are just simply derided and not tolerated there. And not long after I was there giving lectures, I was contacted by a family whose daughter was in private school in Switzerland. Her parents had moved her to yet another private school. She was just miserable and underfunctioning and hated it. Her dad was American. They arranged for her to come to Arlington, Virginia, and live with her godparents, who had two daughters about her age. And she went to public high school in Arlington, just plunked down. And I think she entered in her 10th grade year. And by the time she was a senior, she was president of her senior class. She was taking the lead role in the play that her high school put on that year. She blossomed in the United States with her energy and her creativity and her leadership, whereas in Switzerland, it was precision, punctuality, order, and discipline, which was not how she was going through life. And I can tell you the end of the story because I've been working in the Washington area for so many years. I feel like I've seen a couple of generations roll through, and she has become a successful filmmaker, very creative woman. And I think had she not left that very ADD unfriendly environment, she wouldn't have blossomed.
That's an awesome story. Love that. So, one person asked about menopause and another person asked about hormones. So I guess the broader question is, do hormones impact ADHD? And in particular, going off of birth control or puberty or menopause?
The answer is yes, 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 and yes. One of the reasons why puberty is a very typical age for a girl to be first diagnosed is that's when hormonal fluctuations begin. And for those of us who have raised daughters, we all know that our daughters become hormonal. They become moody, they become reactive without ADHD. But when you add ADHD to the mix, what happens is the brain is a target organ for estrogen. And so when estrogen levels are high, we are more sensitive to dopamine and we're more sensitive to serotonin. So that's mood and focus. So when estrogen levels are high, we can focus better, we're less anxious, we're less moody. When estrogen levels begin to fluctuate, the reverse is true. And so ADHD often rears its head at puberty because not only are they going through puberty with fluctuating hormones, but they're also going to middle school where life is much more complicated, more demands are placed on them, and it's the, perfect time for everything to become overwhelming. So we see that beginning of puberty. Interestingly, many women during pregnancy report that their ADHD really decreases. It's those high estrogen levels. Then it comes roaring back after childbirth because estrogen levels plummet. What's important to understand, and I'm not a physician, I'm not an expert on hormones, but I have been working and lecturing with my longtime writing partner, Patricia Quinn, forever, and she was one of the very first to start beating the drum about the impact of hormones on women with ADHD. And the little bit of research, and it's growing, thank goodness, says that it's not the absolute amount of estrogen in our body, but the fact that it is declining. So women go through, on average, about 10 years of perimenopause before they hit menopause. Perimenopause being that decade in which estrogen levels are declining, and menopause being defined as having no menstrual cycle for at least a year. And those can be very, very difficult years that level out again once you get past menopause. Interestingly, I created a panel at the Adhd conference, an annual conference that happens to be here in Washington every year, which is the American Professional Society for Attention and Related Disorders. And if that's not a title created by a committee, I don't know what is. But anyway, the Adhd convention, and I organized a panel to talk about women with ADHD. And on that panel, I will not name him, but on that panel was a self-invited, uh, very renowned male ADHD researcher. So we all gave our presentations, and then questions came in from the audience about hormones. And a woman asked me, and I said, absolutely, it has a huge impact. Whereupon this highly regarded male ADHD researcher said, I have never witnessed that in my practice. I don't know of any research supporting that. It was just, no, doesn't exist. By contrast, I was on a panel about 3 or 4 months ago that was organized in the UK. And on this panel was a physician from Toronto, a physician from the UK, and myself. And they were talking very readily and matter-of-factly about, yes, it's a well-known phenomenon, and it really helps to stabilize hormone levels to help manage ADHD. So I think we're finally getting to the point that we know a lot more about it, and it's more accepted as a factor.
That is intriguing. So what about, well, willpower and motivation, and how do we increase those things if we have ADHD and those are problematic?
Well, that is a easy question with a very complicated answer. Uh, I am not a big believer in this thing we call willpower, because there are a lot of judgmental connotations that strong people have willpower and weak people don't have willpower. Um, I think that it is absolutely true that people with ADHD, um, if anything, have more intense responses to positive stimulation, and are more drawn to stimulation. To have ADHD in many ways is to be a stimulation seeker. And stimulation often comes to us in the form of sugar, comes to us in the form of excitement, alcohol, risk taking, all kinds of things that may not be good for us. So, how do we develop willpower? There's a wonderful book, and I'm going to hold it up so people can see it. Um, I don't know if you can read this. Tiny Habits. It's a best-selling book, and this fellow is writing in very detailed terms about things I've been trying to teach my clients with ADHD for a long time. And he's not talking about willpower when he's talking about building habits. He's talking about how to make it easier to do the things you want to be able to do and harder to do the things that you want to stop doing. And it's a wonderful, very human, encouraging, step by step guideline to developing better, healthier, more brain healthy daily habits. And so many people with ADHD just get down on themselves. I'm hopeless, you know. Well, guess what? Everybody in the world wakes up on January 1st and said, I'm going to start running, I'm going to lose 10 pounds, I'm going to save money. I mean, blah, blah, blah. You know, we make all these wonderful New Year's resolutions, and by the end of January, they're out the window. So it's not just people with ADHD, although I think people with ADHD do have a harder time and need to develop tactics to get out of the habits that are bad for us and more drawn to the habits that are good for us. And it's a real process. And I really try to tell people we can't do it all at once. And it's really a process of several years of nudging ourselves in the right direction. So very important to not be judgmental about ourselves, or about each other.
Mhm. Absolutely. Somebody asked about Dr. Amen. I think it's Amen pronounced that.
Amen. Daniel Amen.
Amen. And about his research. And if you have any comments on his research or things to say about what he does.
Well, he is definitely an outlier in the medical community. Um, I know him slightly personally. In fact, I, many years ago, intentionally had lunch with him, saying to him that if all of the really exciting things you're talking about are true, then you really owe it to yourself and to the public to quantify it doing the research. You know, that you're making these claims and you believe them to be true, but you haven't done the research that the rest of the medical community requires. And I think that is still the case, that he is very much an outlier, and he gives a rather expensive set of tests, often PET scans, to tell you what type of ADHD you have. But I think that same discernment is fairly easily made in just a good, knowledgeable clinical interview. So I don't think he has, I think a lot of people mistakenly think if I go and have those tests, then they'll know exactly the medication I need. When any skilled psychiatrist is going to know about treating, you know, explosiveness, anxiety, depression, all the things that so often accompany ADHD.
So another fun one. Somebody was asking about, what about driving skills and ADHD? Is there a relationship that we know of there?
Well, we do know that people with ADHD are more likely to have automobile accidents. I'm so glad that the limited permits that teenagers get in Maryland, and I think this is probably true in a lot of places now, don't allow teenagers to drive with other children or teens in the car without an accompanying adult until they get to be at least 18, because there is that distractibility factor. You're chatting, you're chattering, you're showing off, you're missing the fact that somebody is pulled beside you and you change lanes and you crash. I think that it's really important for teens with ADHD to be on medication. You're much less likely to have an automobile accident if you're on medication, if you're not in a car full of distracting friends while you're driving. And that gets better with age. But yeah, it's a risk.
And another person asked, so are people with ADHD then employable, or are, what are our employability prospects, I suppose?
People with ADHD are highly employable, and we do career assessments at the Chesapeake Center all the time. What we need to do is match our brain to the task. And so many people with ADHD know what they're bad at, but they don't really have a sense of what they're good at. ADHD brains have this wonderful thing called hyperfocus. And we see our kids hyper focusing on video games or social media or whatever. And it's because those are intrinsically interesting and reinforcing when you're that age. And it's so critical to find something that absolutely captivates you. I mean, I have had a very long and fascinating and stimulating career, and that has benefited me greatly. There is a Nobel Prize winning chemist named Kary Mullis, and he actually was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry when I happened to be in San Diego, where he lived and still lives. And the front page of the San Diego paper was Kary Mullis wins Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And Ned Hallowell was the keynote speaker at that meeting, and he holds up the newspaper and said, "Has anybody read the paper this morning? Is this guy ADHD or what?" And I don't have time to tell you all my Kary Mullis stories. They're hilarious. But he is one of the most hyperactive human beings you could ever hope to meet, even in late middle age, and yet brilliant. And he won the Nobel Prize because he is brilliant and he found something that fascinated him. And he told the story that the research that he did was sort of the precursor of the Human Genome Project. And he told the story of driving up the California coast in his VW Bug with his girlfriend. I think he was in his late 20s or so at that time. And she had fallen asleep, and it was midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. And he had this idea, and he pulled over to the side of the road and started scribbling his ideas down, woke up his girlfriend, said, "I've had this incredible idea, and I'm going to win the Nobel Prize." And by God, he did. And by God, he did. It was decades later. But there are absolutely brilliant people, very successful people with ADHD. And it's so important that we learn to manage the parts of our ADHD that get in the way, because there are so many really active, creative, outside of the box thinking that goes on in ADHD brains. I remember sitting in a group of teenagers at a conference I was speaking at and just getting them to talk about their ADHD. And they were very cognizant, saying, well, when I want to do my math, I want to be on my medication. But if I'm trying to write poetry, I want to be off my medication, because then I can have this very creative flow of ideas. And we are gifted in that way. And I think one of the sad things is that all of the focus is on what gets in our way. And I think all of the research started with kids having trouble in school. So ADHD has been defined by what makes life difficult and much less defined by what makes life fascinating and successful. There is a small and growing body of research that has found very strong links between creativity and ADHD. And I think it's really important for us to know that and to celebrate it. I'm noticing it is 8:28, and I will take one more question. And
I think this is a good question to end on. And the question is talking about, like, how do you get there to a career that might be amazing and successful for you? What would be kind of the most important accommodations that we might want to make for students with ADHD and associated executive function deficits in college?
Well, I don't think there's a strong link there. So let me talk a little bit about what I talk to people about when we're doing a career assessment at Chesapeake, because what I'm looking for is a sweet spot. We look at cognitive challenges, executive functioning challenges. We look at cognitive strengths. We look at what our strongest abilities are and measure those. We look at what's interesting to you, and we also look at what your core values are, because jobs that are aligned with our core values, we're going to be much more satisfied by and invested in. And we measure all of those things and look for where is the overlap. We can certainly be interested in something we're not naturally good at. That's not a good overlap. We need to be good at it, interested in it. It needs to align with our values, and it needs to not require us to do a lot of things that are tedious or boring to us. And sometimes even within the same career, you can go from being very badly employed to very well employed. And I'll give you just one quick example before we stop tonight, and that is years ago, a young man came to me who had a degree in social work. And he came to me because he was about to get fired. He worked in Fairfax County, and he had an administrative job basically qualifying people for various social benefits. So it was very, very paperwork intensive and not very gratifying. He became a social worker because he wanted to help people. But he's just sitting here filling out forms. And he said, you wouldn't believe the pile of papers on my desk, and I'm always in trouble, and the paperwork is getting in late. And I told him, I think you just are in absolutely the wrong job, given your ADHD brain. And what you went into social work for was to interact with people and to help them. He was able to get a job in a local psychiatric treatment center that worked with adolescents. And I continued to work with him for a few months, and he went from being about to be fired to being one of their top employees. He loved interacting with the kids and helping them, and the job required very little paperwork. He just had to scribble a couple of lines at the end of the day on each of the kids that he'd worked with. So it didn't call on his areas of weakness, and it allowed him to function in his area of strength. So jobs that are ADD unfriendly are paperwork heavy, are tedious, boring, unsatisfying. I work with so many people that get out of college and get an administrative position, especially females, fail at it miserably and feel like, if I can't even do this, I can't do anything, not realizing that they have chosen exactly the wrong kind of job. Most administrative assistants are there to keep somebody else on track. I can't tell you how many women have come to me saying, I think my boss has ADHD, and he or she hired me to keep them in line, and I can't do that. I'm having trouble keeping myself on line.
Your answers to these questions have been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I hope it's been useful for everybody that's listening. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. Nadeau. It's been a wonderful lecture, very pertinent and important. We had a lot of really great questions from the audience, and we hope that we got to the majority of them. You did an awesome job, Terry. There was a lot of questions.